This is Great Britain. It was once a global superpower that had grown to rule over 400 million people, making it the largest empire in history. However, this picture of Britain can now only be seen in history books. The sun has set on the British Empire, and its economy has experienced a decade and a half of struggle characterised by low productivity and high inequality. In other words, the UK has become a stagnant nation. In a recent study by the Resolution Foundation, labour productivity was found to have grown by just 0.4% a year in the UK since the 2008 financial crisis, which is half the rate of the 25 richest OECD countries. This means the UK's productivity gap with France, Germany and the US has doubled over that period and now stands at 18%. Weak productivity has led to declining real wages, which have failed to continue on their pre-2008 trajectory. Having grown by an average of 33% a decade from 1970 to 2007, real wages fell below zero in the 2010s, only recovering to pre-financial crisis levels in mid-2023. These 15 years of lost wage growth have cost the average UK worker £10,700 a year across that period. While stagnant and declining real wage growth has been a problem in the UK for the last 15 years, growing income inequality in the country has been an issue for more than twice as long. Having surged during the 1980s and remained consistently high ever since, income inequality in the UK is higher than any other large European country. The Gini coefficient, a method of calculating and comparing income inequality across countries, shows that the UK ranks second to only the US in terms of its income inequality, with income inequality much lower in most other European countries, especially those in the Nordics. Such productivity and inequality issues have left the UK economy on the brink of collapse. But why has this once great nation fallen into such dire straits, with declining influence and a stumbling economy? And can it all be attributed to Brexit? We will answer all these questions and many more, so give this video a thumbs up and let's dive in. The last decade and a half have been extremely tough for the average household in the UK. Families that were already in a precarious situation before the pandemic have found their standard of living continuing to decline even after the economy fully opened up again. Real GDP per capita growth, a metric often used to measure living standards, has been negative for 7 consecutive quarters, which is the longest run of negative returns since records began in 1955. Not only this, but the size of the contraction has increased in each of the last quarters. And according to some projections, UK standards of living might not recover until the late 2020s. These problems were evident before COVID-19, but have got much worse since, as Britain emerged from the pandemic straight into a cost of living crisis and the highest inflation in 40 years. Energy bills and food prices surged, closely followed by rising housing costs. Despite government support totalling £78 billion, hardship is everywhere to be seen. Inequality in the country is sky high and homelessness is at record levels. And by the last quarter of 2023, the UK economy fell into a technical recession with its GDP shrinking by 0.3%, its second consecutive quarter of negative growth. Over that time, the country has gone through so many changes politically, socially and economically that it would be unrecognisable to anyone from the 1990s. 2016 was the year of the Brexit referendum, dividing opinion across the country and resulting in 51.9% of Britons voting to leave the EU. Brexit has hit the UK economy hard and has sparked controversy across the country on both sides of the debate, as most of the promises given during Brexit campaigning have yet to come to fruition. This has created a period of real political instability, with the UK having 5 different prime ministers in a period of just over 6 years, the fastest turnover in new occupants of 10 Downing Street for nearly a century. Frequent leadership changes have led to constantly changing short-termism policies, contributing to policy uncertainty, affecting investor confidence and economic decision-making. For example, the disastrous appointment of Liz Truss, whose policies included tax cuts for the wealthy, caused market fluctuations and inflationary pressures that almost led to an economic catastrophe. Truss's desire to pay for tax cuts through issuing more debt led to a disastrous sell-off of UK government bonds and the pound. UK mortgage rates and other borrowing costs soared, and the pound dropped to a 30-year low against the US dollar. The Bank of England was forced to intervene, pledging to buy government bonds on whatever scale necessary, while Truss resigned after just 45 days in office. This wildly incompetent string of administrations from the Conservative Party has only caused the geographic divide to widen. And according to the Economy 2030 inquiry by the Resolution Foundation, income per person in Kensington and Chelsea, the richest local authority in the UK, was over 4 times that of the poorest Nottingham in 2019. Now, before we dive into the reasons for this decline, please take a moment to help the channel out by hitting that subscribe button. It only takes 2 seconds, and each new subscriber is a massive help for the channel. Now, back to what I was saying. To understand how the UK's economy got to where it is today, we must first turn back the clock to the 19th century and the Industrial Revolution. During this period, the British Empire was at the height of its power, covering over 1/4 of the total landmass of the world. It was a place of innovation and progress as it led the world during the Industrial Age with inventions such as the steam engine and textile manufacturing innovations such as the spinning jenny. These developments, alongside its aggressive geographic expansion, laid the foundation for Britain's global control of trade and access to precious resources. At this point, the country was brimming with wealth, but just as it seemed nothing could shake it apart, along came 2 world wars to jeopardize everything. The loss of lives and damage to infrastructure during these wars are attributed to the economic decline of a lot of European powers during the early 20th century. But the shift to war-related production during the period, while absolutely necessary at the time, has contributed to the UK's downfall ever since. The UK's national debt rose considerably during this period, with its debt-to-equity ratio exceeding 150% during and after the First World War. And then, during the Second World War, national debt again increased rapidly, peaking at 238% of GDP in 1947. This high level of national debt prompted austerity measures, high taxation, and public spending cuts to manage the economic strain. The country relied on Marshall Plan aid and implemented nationalisation of key industries to support recovery. Despite its huge debt, the UK established the welfare state, introduced the National Health Service, and expanded social security. Economic growth in the 1950s and 1960s, coupled with post-war inflation, gradually reduced the debt burden, and low interest rates and strategic economic planning helped stabilise the economy and diminish the debt-to-GDP ratio over time. By the 1970s, the country began to see a shift away from an industrial-based economy brimming with innovation to a service-based one. This shift was championed by the then Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, who pushed for deregulation and privatisation, resulting in a decline of particular industries such as manufacturing. This made the UK increasingly dependent on imports from the global economy, killing its homegrown industries and its self-sufficiency. It also meant that there was reduced investment in its industrial sector, leading to nationwide layoffs as the service industry requires fewer employees than heavy industry. As a result, unemployment in the UK was very high during the 1980s, peaking at 11.8% in 1984. It was a challenging period for the country, but by the 1990s and early 2000s, the UK was catching up with more productive countries like France, Germany, and the US, having acclimatized to being a service-oriented economy focused on finance, business services, and the arts, while leaving manufacturing to countries with comparative advantages, such as China, India, and Taiwan. However, the UK's transition from an industrial economy to a service economy has created a key weakness: productivity growth. Productivity is the efficiency with which goods and services are produced, directly influencing economic growth, living standards, and competitiveness in the global market. Since the early 2000s, the UK's economic performance has declined relative to the likes of France, Germany, and the US, and has been declining ever since, with the gap in productivity costing the UK £3,400 in lost output per person. Another key challenge for the UK's services-dominated economy is that its exports and productive activity are concentrated in London, which accounts for 63% of the UK's surplus in services trade. High-value services thrive in cities with highly educated populations and where many similar firms can co-locate. But too few of the UK's cities, including both Birmingham and Manchester, have been able to heal the scars left by deindustrialisation and reinvent themselves as service hubs. In fact, all of England's biggest cities outside London have productivity levels below the national average. And as we have already seen, weak productivity growth leads to sluggish income growth and increased inequality. This income inequality has been driven by a combination of top earners pulling away from middle earners, widespread benefit cuts, lower earners working shorter hours, and housing costs rising for poorer households. Low growth and high inequality mean typical households in Britain are now 20% poorer than their German counterparts and 9% poorer than their peers in France, while its low-income families are 27% poorer. In addition to its households being poorer, their access to basic public services is also worse. Put simply, public sector investment in the UK is too low, 50% less than the average OECD country. As a result, the NHS is in crisis, with too few hospital beds and long waiting lists. Beyond healthcare, other public services are creaking, with unreliable trains and understaffed prisons now the norm. Many saw the Brexit referendum, proposed by David Cameron, as an opportunity to reverse this slump and implement change. To restore national sovereignty, control immigration policies, and revitalise the economy by enabling independent trade negotiations. Brexit has certainly brought change to the UK, albeit not always in the form those in favour of it expected. Foreign direct investment has actually held up reasonably well since the referendum, and it is not clear that exports to the EU have fallen disproportionately. However, since Brexit, the UK has suffered a broad-based fall in trade openness, which is measured by comparing the country's total trade to its GDP. Despite negotiating 71 new trade deals, including new deals with Australia and New Zealand, by 2023 UK trade as a share of GDP was down 2.2% on pre-pandemic levels. This is compared to a rise of 0.5% across the rest of the G7 and a 1.7% rise in France, which has a similar trade pattern to the UK. The impact of Brexit is most obvious in UK goods trade, with the UK losing market share across EU and non-EU markets such as the US, Canada and Japan. By the end of 2023, goods trade had shrunk to levels not seen since 2015, while other members of the G7 have actually enjoyed a surge in goods trade over the same period. Whilst losing market share in goods trade, the UK's service sector, including consulting, legal and advertising services, remains resilient. Trade in these services has grown more quickly than goods over the last 20 years and appear unimpacted by Brexit, growing 14% between 2019 and 2023, faster than France, the US and Japan. However, despite these positives, a study by the London School of Economics and the Resolution Foundation has highlighted that by 2030, it is expected that UK firms will export over 24% less than if they had remained in the EU. Changes in trade will affect key sectors of the UK economy in different ways, with its agriculture, fishing and manufacturing sectors ones to look at. It is expected that domestic agricultural output will increase by as much as 20% thanks to reduced competition from EU producers, while the UK's fishing industry, which is highly reliant on European customers, will be hardest hit with output falling by as much as 30%. More importantly for the UK economy is the impact on its manufacturing sector. It is expected that the UK's role in highly integrated EU supply chains will fall over time, impacting sectors such as cars, chemicals, and aviation. Already, the UK's exports of chemicals and transport have fallen much more than the average of G7 countries. So rather than closing regional divides or reinvigorating manufacturing, by the end of the decade, Brexit will see annual real wages £470 lower relative to if the UK was still in the EU. Trade is therefore becoming less important to contributing to the UK's future prosperity, and the vision of global Britain appears less open now than it did 10 years ago. In fact, the chairman of the Office for Budget Responsibility predicts that Brexit will reduce the UK's potential GDP by about 4% in the long term, which is worse than the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. If you want to learn more about the current state of the US economy, head on over to this video where I show you just that. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep building your wealthy life.